As we move through into sort of more the nuts and bolts of the audit, so we are required to talk to the committee about materiality. And materiality in the concept of a financial statement audit really drives two things. First, it sets the scope and the extent of testing that we do. So the higher a materiality level would be, the less scope or less testing that would be required. The lower materiality, obviously, the more testing and more scoping would be required. The second use of materiality is when we evaluate what errors or corrections we may find in our work. So the materiality level means that errors that have not been corrected in the financial statements can't exceed that materiality level. And so we want to make sure that's not the case, and that's never been the case with the region, so I don't want to create unnecessary angst there. But it also, we use a factor of that number to communicate to this committee the types of differences that we found in our audit, so a much lower number. So on the next slide, we sort of articulate what that number is. And so we've set materiality for the consolidated statements of the region at $30 million. And so thinking back to what I said, if there were errors that accumulated above $30 million that were not corrected in the statements, we couldn't issue a clean audit opinion. So usually the first question I get when I say the materiality figure is people say, well, wow, that's a big number. And clearly, management and council and committee looks at things in much more granularity than $30 million. And we do too. It's just a setting figure. But when we set materiality, we sort of think about if your financial statements, say your revenues or say your expenses were sort of over or under by less than $30 million, would somebody looking at the financial statements of the region come to a sort of a different conclusion as to the size and scope of the operations? So when on the right-hand side of the slide, we show sort of total revenues from last year, just a smidgen below 1.4 billion. So if that was higher or lower by $30 million, would that change how an outside user would look at the financial statements? And in that context, we don't think so. We will come back to this group and report any differences that we find in excess of $1.5 million, so 5% of that materiality figure. So we do get much more granular. And then in the testing that we do a lot of statistical sampling and other similar types of tests. We could look at each and every transaction within the region. So no transaction is too small or no transaction is too big. They all have a chance for detection. On the next slide, we reiterate the audit scope as was described or responded to in the question. These are the audits that are required either by the Municipal Act or through the various funding agreements with the region. I want to take a few moments to pause on this slide. And we call it significant risks. And what this risk is the risk that there may be an override of internal controls within the region system to fraudulently misstate the financial statements. So this is a risk that exists in every single audit of financial statements in Canada. So you're not unique with having this be a risk. We're not saying that this is a high risk, but we're saying it is a risk because every entity, regardless of how good its internal control structure is, does have incentives, opportunities, rationalizations within the management group to fictitiously enter accounts or enter transactions. So we're required to respond to this. We've outlined on the right-hand side of the middle section there under audit approach what our general approach is to that. And what we typically do is we look at entries that are recorded within the system and looking for ones that we refer to as either high risk or unusual. So we use some software tools that allow us to take every single transaction for the entire year, put it through some filters, see things that just don't look right or have characteristics that are red flags, We'll do a deep dive on those transactions and make sure there's nothing untoward going on. So what we're not saying here is we're not saying here that we think there's fraud in the financial statements. I want to be very clear about that, but it is a risk that we're required to respond to. But I also do want to note that the audit of the financial statements is not designed to check and find fraud, and that's a limitation of the process. But we are required to think about what the risks might be and respond thereon. Courtney?
Thanks, Matt. So I will be going over some other areas of our focus for the audit. The first area is post-employment benefits, and this includes post-employment benefits as well as sick leave and WSIB. We focus on this area mainly because it's an estimate and has significant judgment used by management as well as management specialists. Our audit approach for post-employment benefits is mainly confirming and communicating with management's actuarial specialist, who is the School Boards Cooperative Incorporated. We will also test the reasonableness of the underlying data, including employee populations. The next area is tangible capital assets, and this area we are focusing on it due to the size, as I believe there's over $1 billion of tangible capital assets at the region, and so the susceptibility of an error happening in this account is higher. Our audit approach for this would be to test capital additions and ensure the existence and accuracy of those additions are appropriate. As well, we would look at the repairs and maintenance and other similar accounts to ensure that the completeness of capital additions and that some of them have not been expensed. The last area of focus I want to discuss is the obligatory reserve fund revenue and deferred revenue. We are focusing on this area due to revenue recognized from development charge reserve funds is subject to judgment, as capital projects must be growth related in nature to be able to recognize the revenue. Some of our audit approach that we will be doing is performing substantive testing over the amounts being recognized as revenue and ensuring that the capital projects that the funding is used for is actually growth related. We also will assess the accounting for waived development charges. And then there are some other deferred revenue accounts that are not obligatory reserve funds. And we'll look at those and determine if the revenue that's being recognized or deferred is appropriate and the related expenditures have been incurred. Next page. So this page just discusses our key milestones and deliverables. So as of now, we're right in our interim work, and in March and April, we will be doing our final field work and reporting. In April, we will be coming back to you to report our findings and to issue our audit report. And then in May, we have a debrief internally about how it went and, if needed, with management. On the next page and the rest of the report, these are just appendices. We won't go through those, they're just for your information. But if you have any questions on them, we definitely can, please ask those.
Okay, so to the chair, that concludes our formal remarks. Happy to take any questions or comments at this time.
Any questions from the committee members? Councillor Deutschmann.
Thanks for the presentation. Very interesting and informative. I was particularly interested in the discussion on the reserve fund and development charges question, and this potential debate on what is growth related in nature seems to be a bit of a subjective assessment, one could say. And how does that get resolved if we say something is related to development charges and you say it's not related to development charges, for example? How do we resolve that question?
So typically, we would go back to the original development charge study that was taken and try to assess how that project fits within that development charge study for which the expenditure is ultimately being, made. In all my years, we've never had a sort of a situation where auditor and finance couldn't agree on whether something was growth related or not. But certainly we would look to gather as much evidence as possible and have management produce whatever evidence they have in order to support their assessment. However, at the end of the day, if we couldn't agree with it, from our perspective, that would result in an uncorrected error in the financial statement.
If we had one view and you had another view, that would be an uncorrected error in your assessment then?
Correct. We would record that as an uncorrected error.
I just know because as politician and staff, sometimes we'll have discussions about what should be covered under DCs or not, just to try to find other avenues. The other thing just got me thinking too, with respect to Bill 23 and the recent discussion about the possibility of the government sending in auditors to take a look at these accounts as well. Would any of your work assist in determining, related to any of that would come up?
I would say unlikely. We would not share our work with, other teams coming in to look at that, because they'd be coming in to look at it for a different purpose. Even if it was from even the Office of the Auditor General of Ontario, again, we're not part of her scope, and so that they would be different buckets, and they'd be looked at from a different perspective.
Okay.
But as you're right to mention the bill, we are carefully watching the developments of that legislation, because we do think there could be impacts to how this is accounted for on a go-forward basis. But it's likely none of that will receive a cent in calendar 2022, and so therefore it's really a non-issue for this year from an accounting perspective. I know it's a big issue for councils, the whole bit, but from a perspective, we don't see it this year.
Does that get identified? Bill 23, does that factor in as a potential risk in the future that comes under this audit, or that's just a whole separate discussion?
That's more of a business. If there's anything that comes out of the bill, if it passes in a sentence that creates risk within the financial statements, we'll assess it at that time.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Councillor James.
Thank you, through chairs. Just a question for clarification. Can you give me a description of the difference between the audit versus a special report? And I'm looking at page 10 on your presentation. Sure.
So for a special report, that may be an audit. I'm just looking to see. Oh, yes. Okay. So some of those are, so the audits, those are audits of a financial statement, a full set of financial statements that includes a statement of financial position, a statement of revenues and expenses, a statement of cash flows and related notes. The special reports are what we call perhaps derivative reports, where it may only be a very specific component of financial information. So for example, the Sunnyside Home annual reconciliation report is only certain revenues and expenses of the Sunnyside Home. So we're only commenting on that. So it's not a full set of financial statements, but they're all audits.
Okay.
Good question.
Thank you.
Councillor Erb.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. This question goes back a bit to Bill 23, and it may be hypothetical at this point, but the province has said that they would make the municipalities whole. There's an argument around the deferral of DCs. And I guess my question would be, if that money would start flowing from the province, how would it be the responsibility of regional staff to make sure that money gets put into the DC accounts, or how would that happen, or is this all speculation at this point?
Well, I believe there's a fair amount of speculation. I'm not sure if Mr. Dyer wants to comment on that, but it would depend on how the money comes in to the municipality and what stipulations would be attached to it. So we're sort of wait and see. So I don't know if Craig has additional comments on that.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. No.
My guess would be that it's hypothetical at this point. It was just something that crossed my mind as you were talking about it. But if Craig wants to respond, I'm always happy to hear from you.
Yep, Mr. Dyer.
I'd be more than happy to respond. Excuse me. So certainly some speculation about how this would actually happen, but thinking through the process, if the intent was for the provincial government to make municipalities whole, then what I suspect would happen is they would find some mechanism to forward funds to municipalities, and we would record these revenues outside of the development charge reserve funds, right? So Bill 23 will reduce the amount of revenue that's collected, reduce the amount of eligible services, reduce the amount of eligible costs. So we'd be funding a larger share of those initial costs from the property tax base and from user rates. So if there was any funding coming in that would make us whole, we would make the non-DC reserves and reserve funds whole at that point.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
I don't have any other questions. Oh, Councillor Deutschman.
Just a quick one. Thank you. I was just curious what the Regional Municipality Waterloo sinking fund is. Are we sinking?
That, and I can let, I don't know if Trish wants to answer that, or I can answer it.
Want to give it a shot?
Sorry. It's a fund that holds monies for the eventual retirement of certain debentures or debts. I'm not sure I could have said that any shorter.
Chair Redmond.
Not to center on Bill 23 too much, but there seems to be a lack of understanding at other levels of government about how our reserve funds work and what they're used for. And I'm wondering, as part of this audit, if we can highlight that as maybe a teachable moment for some of our colleagues at Queen's Park.
Well, certainly we report on the reserve funds. As Courtney mentioned, the DC fund is what's referred to as an obligatory reserve fund. So that's all articulated in your financial statements, and the financial statements are delivered to the province. So that's being given to them. In our role, we really don't have the scope to engage directly with the province at either the political or the staff level to talk about that. But certainly, if any local MPPs want to talk to me, I'm more than happy to talk about it.
Mr. Dyer.
The other thing I might add in response is that each year municipalities are required under the Development Charges Act to produce a very detailed statement, which we refer to as a development charge transaction report. That report will be coming to Administration and Finance Committee likely in March, and we'll go through and identify in great detail on an individual reserve fund basis all of the collections, the interest allocations, and then the uses of those development charge on a project-by-project basis. So it's a long list of projects that ultimately get funded from those reserves. And certainly when that report comes forward this time, we can perhaps spend some additional time on it at Administration and Finance Committee just to walk council through the process that we follow. And we can certainly make those reports available to our colleagues at the province.
Thank you. Seeing no other questions, we'll move to back to Craig Dyer, Commissioner of Corporate Services, to introduce the report with regards to the committee's terms of reference. Mr. Dyer.
Sorry, just a very brief report to do two things. One, to make sure that this committee is aware of the existing terms of reference for this committee. And secondly, to advise that, we think it's, from a staff perspective, we think it's probably appropriate to take a look at those terms of reference. It's been some time since they have been updated, and we would look to do that work in the early part of 2023 and bring any recommended revisions to the terms of reference back to this committee for review and consideration.
I'll call on any questions, if any councillors have any questions of Mr. Dyer. Seeing none, I will call next on Kathy Deschamps, Director of Treasury Services, to introduce the next report on the payment card industry data security standards and compliance. Kathy.
Great, thank you very much. Through you, Mr. Chair. As you know, the region accepts credit cards for various services across all our program areas. We collect credit card payments by phone, over the internet, in person, at kiosks in a number of ways. And there's a set of standards, security standards, so the payment card industry has set up some standards that we're mandated to meet. And our merchant bank, Chase Payment Tech, processes all our credit card transactions, and they require us to meet these certain standards. It's an extensive list of standards. Some of them are operational in nature, and some of them have to do with data security. We worked very closely with the IT division, to meet these compliant requirements. We became compliant in 2022. We will continue to ensure that we meet the standards. And those are my highlights.
I would ask if there are any questions of our colleagues today. Councillor Deutschman.
Yeah, just a question. When people make payments, do we record that information, or we don't hold on to that information? I'm just worried about thinking about hacks or anything like that when people make payments with their credit card.
I'll defer to Tricia on that.
Through you, Mr. Chair, the rules, the standards that Kathy spoke to are very prescriptive about what information can be captured. We record the transactional information to say, if a service was performed and we collected $100, we would record that as revenue. But the actual credit card information, the rules actually don't allow that information to be recorded. And so all of that information is not gathered and not to be in adherence with the standards.
I don't have any other speakers on the question docket, so thank you for the presentations. I'll ask if there is any other business that the committee should be. Oh, yes, Councillor Deutschman.
We should wrap up soon so Jim can get back to his window cleaning job.
Noted.
All the best, Jim.
I'm waiting for my mother outside a medical appointment.
You're a committed man, Councillor Erb. So no other business. I will now ask for a mover and a seconder to adjourn. Moved by Councillor James, seconded by Councillor Deutschman. Please use the yes or no button to vote. Oh, too late now. And that is carried. Meeting adjourned.